Abraham Lincoln, born February 12, 1809, near Hodgenville, Kentucky, U.S., died April 15, 1865, Washington, D.C., was the 16th President of the United States, 1861 to 65, who preserved the Union during the American Civil War and brought the American people to the United States in the NCPO. A hero, Lincoln continues to have a unique appeal to his countrymen and to people in other countries. This appeal derives from his remarkable life story, from humble beginnings to rise to dramatic death, and from his distinctively human and humane personality, as well as from his historical role as the savior of the Union and the freer of enslaved people. His relevance as an exponent of democracy continues and grows because of his eloquence. In his view, the Union was worth saving, not only for its own sake, but because he embodied an ideal, the ideal of self-government. In recent years, the political aspect of Lincoln's character, and particularly his racial views, have come under close scrutiny, as scholars consider him a rich subject for research. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. was dedicated to him on May 30th, 1922. Lincoln was born in a backwoods cabin 3 miles south of Hodgenville, Kentucky, and was taken to a farm in the neighboring valley of Knob Creek when he was 2 years old. His earliest memories are of that home, and especially of a flood that once washed away the corn and pumpkin seeds he helped his father plant. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was the descendant of a weaver's apprentice who had emigrated from England to Massachusetts in 1637. Although he was less prosperous than some of his Lincoln predecessors, Thomas was a strong pioneer. On June 12, 1806, he married Nancy Hanks. The Hanks genealogy is difficult to trace, but it appears that Nancy's birth was illegitimate. She is described as shoulder-shouldered, thin-breasted, melancholy, and fervently religious. Thomas and Nancy Lincoln had 3 children, Sarah, Abraham, and Thomas, who died in infancy. In December 1816, faced with a lawsuit challenging the title to his Kentucky farm, Thomas Lincoln moved his family to southwestern Indiana. There, stranded on public land, he hastily erected a half-faced camp, a rough structure with one side open to the weather and tree branches, in which the family took shelter behind a blazing fire. He soon built a permanent cabin, and later purchased the land on which it stood. Abraham helped clear the fields and tend the crops, but initially developed a dislike for hunting and fishing. In later years, he recalled the cry of the panther, the bears that hunted the hogs, and the poverty of Indiana frontier life, which sometimes seemed too good. The most unpleasant period of his boyhood came after his mother died in the fall of 1818. At the age of 9, he saw her buried in the woods, then faced a winter without the warmth of a mother's love. Fortunately, before the second winter began, Thomas Lincoln married Sarah Bush Johnston, who had moved from Kentucky to Indiana to raise a family with Thomas Lincoln. A widow with 2 girls and a boy, she had the energy and affection to save and ran the household with an equal hand, treating both children as if she had given birth to them all, but she was especially fond of Abraham, and he of her. She later referred to her stepmother as her angel mother. His stepmother undoubtedly encouraged Lincoln's love of reading, yet the true source of his desire to learn remains a mystery. Both of his parents were almost completely illiterate, and he himself received little formal education. He once said that as a boy he had been to school from the little children, now a little, and then a little, and that his entire schooling did not exceed a year's attendance. His neighbors later recalled how he would run for miles to borrow books. However, according to his own account, his early environment provided absolutely nothing to excite aspirations for education. Of course, when I came of age, I had not much knowledge. Still, somehow or other, I could read, write, and do according to the rule of three. But that was all. Apparently, the young Lincoln did not read a large number of books, but absorbed well the few that he did read. These included George Washington's life and memorable actions of Parson Weems, with his little hatchet and the story of the cherry tree, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and Aesop's Fables. From his earliest days, he had some acquaintance with the Bible, for it was undoubtedly the only book his family owned. In March 1830, the Lincoln family made a second migration, this time to Illinois, Lincoln himself driving a team of oxen. Having reached only 21 years of age, he was about to begin his life. 6 feet 4 inches tall, he was rough and frail, but muscular and physically powerful. He was especially noted for the skill and strength with which he could wield an axe. He spoke with a backwoodsman's voice and walked with a long, flat-footed, cautious gait like a plowman. Somewhat moody despite his good nature, he was gifted as a mimic and storyteller, and he easily attracted friends, but he had yet to demonstrate whatever other talents he had. After his arrival in Illinois, not wishing to become a farmer, Lincoln tried his hand at various occupations. As a rail splitter, he helped clear and fence his father's new farm. As a flatboatman, he sailed down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, Louisiana. This was his second visit to that city. His first had been in 1828, when he was still living in Indiana. Returning to Illinois, he settled in New Salem, a village of about 25 families on the Sangamon River. There he worked intermittently as storekeeper, postmaster, and surveyor. With the advent of the Black Hawk War, 1832, he enlisted as a volunteer and was elected captain of his company. He later joked that he had seen no live fighting Indians during the war, but had a very bloody struggle with mosquitoes. Meanwhile, aspiring to become a legislator, he was defeated in his first attempt and was repeatedly elected to the state assembly. He considered blacksmithing as a trade, but eventually decided in favor of law. Having already taught himself grammar and mathematics, he began to study law books. After passing the bar examination in 1836, he began to practice law. The following year, he moved to Springfield, Illinois, the new state capital, which offered far greater opportunities for a lawyer than New Salem. Lincoln was first a partner of John T. Stewart, then Stephen T. Logan, and finally, from 1844, William H. Herndon. About 10 years younger than Lincoln, Herndon was more well-read, more emotional at the bar, and generally more outspoken in his opinions. Yet this partnership seems to have been as perfect as human arrangements have ever been. Lincoln and Herndon kept some records of their law business, and whenever either of them was paid, they divided the cash between them. They seem not to have quarreled over money. Within a few years of his move to Springfield, Lincoln was earning $1,200 to $1,500 a year, at a time when the state governor was paid $1,200 and circuit judges only $750. He had to work hard. To keep himself busy, he found it necessary not only to practice in the capital, but also to follow the court as he made his rounds. Each spring and fall he traveled hundreds of miles by horseback or buggy over the sparsely settled prairie, from one small county seat to another. Most cases were minor and the fees were low. The advent of the railroad, especially after 1850, made travel easier and practice more profitable. Lincoln served as a lobbyist for the Illinois Central Railroad helping it obtain a charter from the state, and was thereafter retained as a regular attorney for that railroad. After successfully defending the company against McLean County's attempts to tax its property, he received the largest single fee of his legal career, $5,000. He had to sue the Illinois Central to collect the fee. He also handled cases for other railroads and for banks, insurance companies, and commercial and manufacturing firms. In one of his best performances before the bar, he defended the first Rock Island Bridge spanning the Mississippi River from a threat from river transportation interests that demanded its removal. His practice included numerous patent suits and criminal cases. One of his most effective and famous pleas involved a murder trial. A witness claimed to have seen Lincoln's acquaintance Duff Armstrong taking part in the assassination by moonlight. Citing a calendar for evidence, Lincoln argued that the night was too dark for the witness to see anything clearly, and with a sincere and moving appeal, he won an acquittal. By the time he began to figure prominently in national politics, about 20 years after the start of his legal career, Lincoln had established himself as one of the most distinguished and successful lawyers in Illinois. He was renowned not only for his shrewdness and practical wit, which enabled him to see every legal matter through to the heart, but also for his unwavering fairness and complete honesty. While living in New Salem, Lincoln became acquainted with Anne Rutledge. He apparently loved her, and he certainly mourned her untimely death in 1835, at the age of 22, with the entire community. After this, stories of a grand romance between Lincoln and Rutledge were told, but these stories are not supported by strong historical evidence. A year after Rutledge's death, Lincoln had a half-hearted affair with Mary Owens, who eventually concluded that Lincoln lacked those little connections which make a woman's chain of happiness. She rejected his proposal. As far as is known, Lincoln's first and only true love was Mary Todd. High-spirited, quick-witted, and well-educated, Todd came from a respected Kentucky family, and her Springfield relatives were among the city's social elite. Some of them resented her association with Lincoln, and from time to time she even doubted whether he could ever make her happy. They nevertheless became engaged. Then, on a day in 1841 that Lincoln recalled as the fatal 1st of January, apparently at his instigation, the engagement broke off. For some time after, Lincoln was overcome by terrible depression and despair. The two eventually reconciled, and they were married on November 4th, 1842. 4 children, all boys, were born to the Lincolns. Edward Baker was about 4 years old when he died, and William Wallace, Willie, was 11. Robert Todd, the eldest, was the only one of the children to survive to adulthood, although Lincoln's favorite Thomas, Todd, who had a cleft palate, outlived his father. Lincoln left the upbringing of his children largely to their mother, who was alternately strict and gentle in her treatment of them. The Lincolns took a mutually affectionate interest in their boys' activities and welfare, enjoyed each other's company, and missed each other when separated, as is evident from extant letters. Like most married couples, the Lincolns had their own domestic quarrels, which were sometimes severe, but which were undoubtedly exaggerated by contemporary gossip. She suffered from recurring headaches, fits of rage, and a sense of insecurity and loneliness that was exacerbated by her husband's prolonged absences on the lawyer's circuit. After his election to the presidency, she was affected by the death of her son Willie. The irony of a war that had turned Kentucky relatives and friends into enemies, and the unfair public criticism of her as mistress of the White House. She developed an obsessive need to spend money, and she ran up embarrassing bills. She also displayed some painful scenes of wifely jealousy. Finally, in 1875, she was officially declared insane, although by then she had already gone through the further trauma of seeing her husband murdered at her side. During her earlier married life, she undoubtedly encouraged her husband and worked to fulfill his own ambitions. During their later years, she probably strengthened and tested his natural qualities of endurance and patience. Lincoln was a skeptic and an independent thinker in early life. His reputation was such that, as he once complained, the influence of the church was used against him in politics. When running for Congress in 1846, he issued a handbill denying that he had ever speak with deliberate disrespect to religion. He explained that he believed in the theory of necessity, that the human mind is compelled to act or kept at rest by some force over which the mind itself has no control. Throughout his life, he also believed in dreams and other mysterious signs and portents. As he grew older, and especially after becoming president and facing the soul-stirring responsibilities of the Civil War, he developed a deep religious sense, and he increasingly saw necessity as God. He came to see himself with great humility as an instrument, and to see all of history as God's agency. In the present Civil War, he wrote in 1862, "It is quite possible that God's purpose may be somewhat different from the purpose of either party, and yet human instruments, as they operate, are the best adapted to effect his purpose." Lincoln was fond of the Bible and knew it well. He was also fond of Shakespeare. In private conversation, he used many of Shakespeare's allusions, discussed problems of dramatic interpretation with considerable insight, and recited long passages from memory with rare feeling and understanding. He liked the works of John Stuart Mill, especially on liberty, but disliked heavy or metaphysical works. Although he enjoyed the poems of Lord Byron and Robert Burns, his favorite poem was by an obscure Scottish poet, William Knox. Lincoln often quoted Knox's lines, "Oh, why should the mortal spirit boast?" He enjoyed relaxing with the comedies of Petroleum Biff Naseby, Orpheus C. Kerr, and Artemus Ward, or with visits to the popular theater. When Lincoln first entered politics, Andrew Jackson was president. Lincoln shared the sympathies that the Jacksonians had for the common man, but he disagreed with the Jacksonian view that government should be separated from economic institutions. "The legitimate object of government," he later said, "is to do for the community of people whatever needs to be done, but which they, in their separate and individual capacities, cannot do at all, or do not do well enough for themselves." Among the prominent politicians of his time, he most admired Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. Clay and Webster advocated using the powers of the federal government to encourage business and develop the country's resources through a national bank, protective tariffs, and a program of internal improvements to facilitate transportation. In Lincoln's view, Illinois and the West as a whole were in dire need of such aid for economic development. From the beginning, he aligned himself with Clay and Webster's party, the Whigs. As a Whig member of the Illinois state legislature, to which he was elected 4 times, from 1834 to 1840, Lincoln devoted himself to a grand project to build a network of railroads, highways, and canals with state funds. Whigs and Democrats joined in passing an omnibus bill for these works, but the Panic of 1837 and the resulting business depression caused most of them to be abandoned. While in the legislature, he demonstrated that, although opposed to slavery, he was not an abolitionist. In 1837, in response to the mob murder of Elijah Lovejoy, an anti-slavery newspaper man from Alton, the legislature introduced resolutions condemning the abolitionist societies in the southern states as sacred under the federal constitution and defending slavery. Lincoln refused to vote for the resolutions. With a fellow member, he wrote a protest that declared that, on the one hand, slavery was both an injustice and a bad policy, and on the other, that the enforcement of abolitionist doctrines increases rather than diminishes its evils. During his single term in Congress, 1847 to 49, Lincoln, as the only Whig from Illinois, devoted little attention to legislative matters. He proposed a bill for the gradual and compensatory emancipation of enslaved people in the District of Columbia, but because it was to be enacted only with the approval of the free white citizens of the district, it angered the enslavers as well as the slaveholders and was never seriously considered. Lincoln devoted much of his time to presidential politics, making one president, one Democrat, and the other a Whig. He found an issue and a candidate in the Mexican War. With his spot resolutions, he challenged President James K. Polk's claim that Mexico had started the war by shedding American blood on American soil. Along with other members of his party, Lincoln voted to condemn Polk and the war, while also voting for supplies to continue it. At the same time, he worked hard to secure the nomination and election of war hero Zachary Taylor. After Taylor's victory in the election, Lincoln had expected to be named Commissioner of the General Land Office in recognition of his campaign services and was bitterly disappointed when he failed to secure the job. His criticisms of the war, meanwhile, were unpopular with voters in his own congressional district. At age 40, disillusioned with politics, he seemed to be at the end of his public career. For about 5 years, Lincoln played little part in politics, and then a new class crisis gave him the opportunity to re-emerge and enter politics. In 1854, his political rival, Stephen A. Douglas, introduced a bill through Congress to reopen the entire Louisiana purchase to slavery and to allow the settlers of Kansas and Nebraska, with popular sovereignty, to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery in those territories. The Kansas-Nebraska Act provoked violent opposition in Illinois and other states of the Old Northwest. It gave birth to the Republican Party while sending the Whig Party on a path to disintegration. Along with thousands of other displaced Whigs, Lincoln soon became a Republican, 1856. Before long, some prominent Republicans in the East were talking about attracting Douglas to the Republican cause, and with it, his Democratic following in the West. Lincoln would have none of it. He was determined that he, not Douglas, should be the Republican leader of his state and class. Lincoln challenged the incumbent Douglas for a Senate seat in 1858, and their series of debates throughout Illinois was a political statement of the highest order. Both men were shrewd debaters and skilled stump speakers, though they could hardly have been more different in style and form. The short and pudgy Douglas, whose stentorian voice and charming gestures captivated audiences, and the tall, homely, almost frail-looking Lincoln, whose voice was strange and gruff. Lincoln's prose and speeches, however, were eloquent, mature, powerful, and free from the eloquence so common in the discourse of his day. These debates were published in 1860 in a best-selling book, along with a biography of Lincoln that Lincoln himself compiled and marketed as part of his campaign. In their basic views, Lincoln and Douglas were not as far apart as they seemed in the heat of political debate. Neither was an abolitionist nor a slaveholder. But Lincoln, unlike Douglas, insisted that Congress should exclude slavery from the territories. He disagreed with Douglas's belief that the territories were inherently unsuitable for a slave economy and that no congressional legislation was needed to prevent the spread of slavery in them. In one of his most famous speeches, he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe that no government can permanently tolerate a state half slave and half free. He predicted that the country would eventually become all one or all. He repeatedly insisted that the civil liberties of every American citizen, white and black, were at stake. He added that the territories should be kept free because new free states were places for the poor to go and improve their condition. He agreed with Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers, however, that slavery should be tolerated, not directly attacked. In fact, when it was politically expedient to do so, he assured his audience that he did not endorse citizenship for blacks or believe in the equality of the races. I am not, and never have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races, he told a crowd in Charleston, Illinois. I am not in favor of making Negroes voters or judges, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor of intermarrying with white people. He added, there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races from living together on a basis of social and political equality. Lincoln raised the inconsistency between Douglas's principle of popular sovereignty and the Dred Scott decision, 1857, in which the U.S. Supreme Court held that Congress could not constitutionally exclude slavery from the territories. Lincoln ultimately lost the election to Douglas. Although the result did not surprise him, it deeply depressed him. Nevertheless, Lincoln gained national recognition and was soon mentioned as a presidential prospect for 1860. On May 18, 1860, after skillful preparations by Lincoln and his friends, he was nominated on the third ballot at the Republican National Convention in Chicago. He then set aside his law practice and, although he did not make any stump speeches, devoted his full time to directing his campaign. His principal object, he wrote, was to hedge against divisions in the Republican ranks, and he advised party workers to say nothing on points where we might disagree. With Republicans united, Democrats divided, and a total of 4 candidates in the field, he entered the race on November 6th. Although he received no votes from the Deep South, and no more than 40 out of 100 in the country as a whole, the popular vote was so divided that he won a clear and decisive majority in the Electoral College. After Lincoln's election and before his inauguration, the state of South Carolina declared its secession from the Union. To prevent similar action by other Southern states, various compromises were proposed in Congress. Most important, the Crittenden Compromise included constitutional amendments guaranteeing slavery in perpetuity in states where it already existed and dividing the territories between slavery and freedom. Although Lincoln had no objection to the first of these amendments, he was steadfastly opposed to the Second Amendment and, indeed, to any scheme that would infringe on the free soil plank of his party's platform. I am flexible, he wrote privately. He feared that a territorial division, by sanctioning the principle of the expansion of slavery, would only encourage the plantation imperialists to seek new territory for slavery south of the American border and thus put us back on the heights of the slave empire. From his home in Springfield, he advised the Republicans in Congress to vote against the division of territories, and the proposal was defeated in committee. 6 additional states subsequently seceded, and together with South Carolina, formed the Confederate States of America. Thus, before Lincoln moved into the White House, the country was in a state of crisis of discord. Attention, both North and South, focused particularly on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. This fort, still under construction, was guarded by American troops under Major Robert Anderson. The Confederacy claimed it, and from other forts in the harbor, threatened it. Anticipating trouble, Lincoln, while in Springfield, secretly requested General-in-Chief of the U.S. Army, Winfield Scott, to be prepared to capture or recapture the forts as the situation may require at the time of the inauguration and afterwards. In his inaugural address, March 4, 1861, in addition to maintaining the Union's destruction and appealing to class harmony, Lincoln reiterated his Sumter policy as follows. Without waiting for the arrival of Lincoln's expedition, Confederate officials presented Major Anderson with a demand for the immediate evacuation of Sumter, which he refused. On April 12, 1861, at dawn, Confederate batteries in the harbor opened fire. Then and thus, Lincoln informed Congress when it met on July 4th, the government invaders commenced a conflict of arms. However, the Confederates accused him of being the real invader. He said that he had cleverly prepared them to fire the first shot in order to charge them with war crimes. Although some historians have repeated this charge, it seems to be a gross distortion of the facts. Lincoln was determined to preserve the Union, and to do so, he thought he must take a stand against the Confederacy. He concluded that he could take that stand at Sumter. Lincoln's primary goal was neither to provoke war nor to keep the peace. In protecting the Union, he would have been happy to keep the peace, but he was willing to risk a war that he thought would be short. After the firing at Fort Sumter, Lincoln called for troops from the state governors. Virginia and 3 other states in the Upper South responded by joining the Confederacy. He then declared a blockade of southern ports. These actions, the Sumter Campaign, the call for volunteers, and the blockade, were Lincoln's first major decisions as head of the Army and Navy. But he still needed a strategic plan and a command system to carry it out. General Scott advised him to avoid a battle with the Confederate forces in Virginia, gain control of the Mississippi River, and put the South under enormous pressure by tightening the blockade. Lincoln had little faith in Scott's relatively passive and bloodless Anaconda Plan. He believed that if the war was to be won, it would have to be fought actively. Overriding Scott, he ordered a direct advance on the Virginia front, which resulted in the defeat of the Federal forces at Bull Run, July 21, 1861. After more or less sleepless nights, Lincoln prepared a set of memoirs on military policy. His basic thinking was that the armies should advance simultaneously on several fronts, and that he should advance so as to gain the support of the Unionists in Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, and East Tennessee. As a war leader, Lincoln used the style that had served him well as a politician. He preferred to react to problems and situations that others created rather than to formulate policies and develop long-range designs. Frankly, he wrote, "I claim not to control events, but I frankly admit that events have controlled me." His guiding principle was, "My policy is to have no policy." It was not that he was unprincipled. Rather, he was a practical man, mentally agile and flexible, and if one course of action or decision proved unsatisfactory in practice, he was willing to experiment with another. From 1861 to 1864, reluctant to impose his ideas on his generals, Lincoln experimented with command personnel and organization. Accepting Scott's resignation, November 1861, he put George B. McClellan in charge of the armies as a whole. A few months later, fed up with McClellan's sluggishness, "He has a slowness," as Lincoln put it, he demoted him to command the Army of the Potomac alone. He questioned the accuracy of McClellan's plans for the Peninsula Campaign, repeatedly forced McClellan to alter them, and, after failing to capture Richmond, Virginia, June 25 to July 1, 1862, ordered its abandonment. He then tried a succession of commanders for the army in Virginia: John Pope, McClellan again, Ambrose E. Burnside, Joseph Hooker, and George Gordon Meade, but was disappointed with each of them in turn. Meanwhile, he had a general-in-chief in Henry W. Halleck, who advised and served as a liaison to field officers, but who was removed from making major decisions. For nearly 2 years, the federal armies lacked an effective unity of command. President Lincoln, General Halleck, and Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton acted as an informal council of war. In addition to transmitting official orders through Halleck, Lincoln also communicated directly with the generals, sending personal proposals in his own name. To the generals who opposed Robert E. Lee, he advised that the goal was to destroy Lee's army, not to capture Richmond or drive the invader from the north. Lincoln finally looked west for a superior general. He praised Ulysses S. Grant's Vicksburg campaign in Mississippi. 9 days after the surrender of Vicksburg, which occurred on July 4, 1863, he sent Grant a grateful acknowledgement of almost unparalleled service to the country. Lincoln also sent an admission of his mistake. He said he had expected Grant to bypass Vicksburg and move down the Mississippi instead of crossing the river and turning back to reach Vicksburg from behind. "I was afraid that was a mistake," he wrote in his congratulatory letter. "I now wish to personally confess that you were right and I was wrong." In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to lieutenant general and gave him command of all federal troops. Lincoln finally found a man who, along with capable subordinates like William T. Sherman, Philip Sheridan, and George H. Thomas, could carry out the parts of Lincoln's concept of a large-scale coordinated offensive that had yet to be done. Grant was only one member, albeit an important one, of a high command arrangement that Lincoln eventually devised. Lincoln himself supervised everything, the commander-in-chief. Taking charge of men and supplies was Secretary of War Stanton. Halleck, who served as presidential advisor and liaison to the military men, was chief of staff. And directing all the armies, while Meade had the Army of the Potomac, was Grant, the general-in-chief. Thus, Lincoln took the lead in forming a high command, an organization that would unite all the energies and resources of the people in the grand strategy of the total war. He combined the statesmanship and the overall direction of the armies with an effectiveness that increased from year to year. His achievement is all the more remarkable in view of his lack of training and experience in the art of war. This deficiency may have been an advantage as well as a handicap. Without being influenced by military dogma, Lincoln could have better applied his practical insight and common sense, some would say his military genius, to the victory of the Civil War. There can be no doubt about Lincoln's deep and sincere devotion to personal liberty. He spoke frequently and eloquently on the subject before he was elected to the presidency. In 1854, for example, he said that he detested Douglas's indifference to the possible spread of slavery to new territories. "I detest it because it is a cruel injustice," he declared. "I detest it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world. It enables the enemies of free institutions to slander us as hypocrites." In 1855, writing to his friend Joshua Speed, he recalled a steamboat trip down the Ohio River 14 years earlier. "You will remember, as I do," he said, "that on the ship from Louisville to the mouth of the Ohio, there were 10 or a dozen slaves, bound with irons. The sight was a constant torment to me, and I see the same thing every time I touch an Ohio or any other slave." Nevertheless, as president, Lincoln was at first reluctant to adopt an abolitionist policy. There were several reasons for his reluctance. He had been elected on a platform pledging not to interfere with slavery within the states, and in any case, He doubted the constitutionality of federal action under the circumstances. He was concerned about the possible difficulties of integrating the nearly 4 million African Americans, once freed, into the social and political life of the country. Above all, he felt that he must keep the border slave states in the Union, and he feared that the abolition program might turn them, especially his native Kentucky, toward the Confederacy. So he held back while others pushed forward. When Generals John C. Fremont and David Hunter, within their respective military departments, proclaimed freedom for people enslaved by disloyal masters, Lincoln rescinded the proclamations. When Congress passed the Confiscation Acts in 1861 and 1862, he refrained from fully enforcing the provisions that authorized him to seize slave property. And when Horace Greeley, in the New York Tribune, urged him to enforce these laws, Lincoln responded with restraint. August 22, 1862. Meanwhile, in response to the growing anti-slavery sentiment, Lincoln came up with his own plan for emancipation. According to his proposal, slaves were to be freed by state action, slaves were to be compensated, the federal government was to share the financial burden. The process of emancipation was to be gradual, and the freed people were to be colonized abroad. Congress indicated its willingness to vote for the necessary funds for Lincoln's plan, but none of the border slave-holding states were willing to undertake it, and in any case, few Black American leaders wanted to see their people sent abroad. Lincoln signed the District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act on April 16, 1862, which resulted in the emancipation of about 3,000 slaves in the nation's capital. Hoping for the ultimate success of his gradualist plan, Lincoln took a completely different approach by issuing his initial, September 22, 1862, and final, January 1, 1863, Emancipation Proclamation. This famous decree, which he justified as an exercise of the president's war powers, applied only to those parts of the country actually under Confederate control, not to the loyal slave states or to the federally held territories of the Confederacy. Directly or indirectly, the proclamation freed fewer than 200,000 slaves during the war. Yet, it had great symbolic significance. It signaled that the Lincoln administration had included freedom for reunification as an object of the war, and it appealed to liberal opinion in England and Europe to increase support for the Union cause. When news of the Emancipation Proclamation finally reached the distant state of Texas on June 19, 1865, more than 2 years after Lincoln's proclamation, the newly freed slaves immediately began celebrating, with prayer, feasting, song, and dancing, giving rise to the national holiday known as Juneteenth, or Independence Day. Lincoln himself doubted the constitutionality of his own move, except as a temporary war measure. After the war, the slaves freed by the proclamation would have risked being re-enslaved if nothing else had been done to confirm their freedom. But something else was done. The 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution, and Lincoln played a major role in bringing about this change in the fundamental law. Through his role as chairman of the Republican National Committee, he urged the party to include a provision for such an amendment in its 1864 platform. As adopted, the Platt stated that slavery was the cause of the rebellion, that the president's proclamation was intended to deal the death blow to that great evil, and that it was necessary to end the constitutional amendment forever. When Lincoln was re-elected on this platform, and the Republican majority in Congress increased, he was justified in feeling, as he apparently did, that he had the people's mandate for the 13th Amendment. The newly elected Congress, with its heavy Republican majority, was not to meet until after the lame duck session of the old Congress, during the winter of 1864 to 65. Lincoln did not wait. Using his resources to patronize and persuade some Democrats, he succeeded in obtaining the necessary two-thirds vote before the end of the session. He expressed joy when the amendment went to the states for ratification, and he repeatedly rejoiced when his own Illinois carried it forward and other states, one by one, followed suit. He did not live to see its eventual adoption. Lincoln deserves his reputation as the great Redeemer. His claim to that honor, if it rests precariously on his famous proclamation, has a solid foundation in the support he gave to the anti-slavery amendment. It is also well-founded in his greatness as a war leader who led the nation safely through a 4-year struggle that brought freedom in its train. And finally, it is reinforced by the practical demonstrations he gave of respect for human worth and dignity, regardless of color. During the last 2 years of his life, he welcomed African Americans as guests and friends in a way that no president before him had done. One of his friends was the prominent former slave, Frederick Douglass, who once wrote, "In all my interviews with Mr. Lincoln, I was struck by his complete freedom from prejudice against the colored race." To win the war, President Lincoln had to win public support. The reunification of the North and the South required, first of all, a certain degree of unity in the North. But in the North, there were various groups with their own specific interests. Lincoln was faced with the task of winning the support of as many different groups and individuals as possible for his administration. Accordingly, he devoted much of his time and attention to politics, one aspect of which was the art of winning such support. Fortunately for the Union cause, he was a president of rare political skill. He had the talent to appeal to fellow politicians and speak to them in their language. He had the talent to smooth over personal differences and to maintain the loyalty of men who were opposed to each other. Having inherited the spoils system, he made good use of it, disposing of government jobs in such a way as to strengthen his administration and advance his government objectives. The opposition party remained alive and strong. Its membership included both war Democrats and peace Democrats, often called Copperheads, some of whom collaborated with the enemy. Lincoln did what he could to gain the support of the war Democrats, as in securing timely ratification of the 13th Amendment from Congress. As far as possible, he made peace with the peace Democrats. He heeded the complaint of one of them, Governor Horatio Seymour of New York, regarding the draft quota for that state. He commuted the prison sentence of Clement L. Willendigham, another Ohio congressman, to exile within Confederate lines. In dealing with those suspected of treasonable intent, Lincoln sometimes authorized his generals to make arbitrary arrests. He justified this action on the grounds that he had to allow the temporary sacrifice of parts of the Constitution in order to preserve the Union and thus preserve the Constitution as a whole. He allowed his generals to suspend several newspapers, but only for a short time, and he immediately rescinded the military order suppressing the hostile Chicago Times. In a letter to one of his generals, he expressed his policy thus: "Considering the dangers and provocations of the time, Lincoln was quite liberal in his treatment of political opponents and the opposition press. He did not often accuse the dictator's critics of anything. Nevertheless, his abrogation of civil liberties, especially the suspension of his writ of habeas corpus privilege, troubled Democrats, Republicans, and even members of his own cabinet. In the opinion of a soldier from Massachusetts, the president, without the people having any legal means of preventing it, is only restrained from exercising the Russian dictatorship by the fear that he will greatly shock the sense of decency of the whole world." Even Lincoln's friend Orville Hackman Browning believed that the president's arrests were illegal and arbitrary, and did more harm than good, weakening the government rather than strengthening it. Yet Lincoln defended his actions, arguing that the Constitution authorized the suspension of such liberties in cases of rebellion or invasion, when the public safety may require it. Furthermore, Lincoln rhetorically posed, "Should I shoot a simple soldier boy who deserts, and not touch a hair of a cunning agitator who tempts him to desert?" Within his own party, Lincoln faced factionalism and personal rivalries that troubled him as much as the activities of the Democrats. It is true that he and most of his colleagues largely agreed on their basic economic objectives. With his approval, the Republicans enacted into law the essentials of the program he had advocated since his early Whig days: a protective tariff, a national banking system, and federal aid for internal improvements, especially the construction of railroads to the Pacific coast. However, the Republicans disagreed on many issues regarding the conduct and objectives of the war. Two main factions emerged: the Radicals and the Conservatives. Lincoln himself leaned toward the Conservatives, but he also had friends among the Radicals, and he sought to maintain his leadership over both. In appointing his cabinet, he selected his many rivals for the 1860 nomination, and together they represented every major group in the party. Wisely, he included the outstanding conservative, Seward, and the brilliant radical, Salmon P. Chase. He deftly handled cabinet crises and kept both of them among his government advisers until Chase's resignation in 1864. Lincoln had to deal with even more serious factional rebellions in Congress. The major issue was the reconstruction of the South. With the seceded states of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee largely restored by federal troops, Lincoln proposed his 10% plan in late 1863, according to which new state governments could be formed only when 10% of eligible voters had sworn an oath of future loyalty to the United States. The Radicals rejected Lincoln's proposal as too lenient, and they introduced the Wade-Davis bill through Congress, which would have allowed the states to be reorganized and reformed only after a majority had sworn an oath of allegiance. When Lincoln vetoed the bill, its authors published a manifesto denouncing it. Lincoln was already the candidate for re-election for the presidency of the Union, i.e. Republican Party, and the Wade-Davis manifesto signaled a movement within the party to remove him as the party's nominee. They waited quietly and patiently for the movement to die down, but even after doing so, the party was badly divided. A rival Republican candidate, John C. Fremont, who had long been nominated by a secessionist group, was still in the field. The leading radicals promised to obtain Fremont's return if Lincoln would obtain the resignation of his conservative Postmaster General, Montgomery Blair. Fremont eventually backed down, and Blair resigned. The party was reunited in time for the 1864 election. In 1864, as in 1860, Lincoln was the chief strategist of his own campaign. He helped manage the Republican Speaker's Bureau, advised state committees on campaign strategies, hired and fired civil servants to bolster party support, and worked hard to get as many soldiers and sailors to vote as possible. Most citizens in uniform voted Republican. He was re-elected with a larger popular majority, 55%, than his Democratic opponent, General George B. McClellan. In 1864, the Democratic platform called for a ceasefire and a peace conference, and prominent Republicans as well as Democrats urged Lincoln to heed the Confederate peace offers, however irregular and deceptive they were. In a public letter, he stated his terms. When conservatives protested to him the implication that the war should continue to free the slaves even after reunification had been won, he explained, "It seems to me plain that reunification and the renunciation of slavery will be considered if offered, not saying that nothing more or less will be considered if offered. After his re-election, in his annual message to Congress, he said, "By stating a condition of peace, I mean only that the war will cease on the part of the government, whenever it shall be ended on the part of those who started it." On February 3, 1865, he met with the Confederate commissioners in person on a steamship in Hampton Roads, Virginia. He promised to be liberal with amnesty if the South would leave the war, but he insisted on reunification as a precondition for any peace arrangement. In his second inaugural address, he embodied the spirit of his policy in the famous words, "with malice toward none, with charity toward all." His terms satisfied neither Confederate leaders nor radical Republicans, and therefore no peace was possible until the final defeat of the Confederacy. At the end of the war, Lincoln's policy for the defeated South was unclear in all its details, although he continued to believe that the main goal should be to restore the separate states, so-called, to their proper practical relation with the Union as soon as possible. He had no fixed and uniform program for the entire region. As he said in the last public speech of his life, April 11, 1865, "So great were the peculiarities of each state, and such important and sudden changes occurred from time to time, and so new and unprecedented was the whole problem, that no special and complicated plan could safely be proposed." With regard to states such as Louisiana and Tennessee, he continued to insist on accepting the new governments established during the war under his 10% plan. In the case of states like Virginia and North Carolina, he seemed willing to use the old rebel governments as a temporary measure to transition from war to peace. He was on record opposing the appointment of outsiders, carpetbaggers, to govern the South. He hoped that in the formation of the new state governments, the Southerners themselves would find some way by which whites and blacks could gradually live out of their old relation to each other, and both come out better prepared for the new. He believed that a program of education for the freedmen was necessary to prepare them for their new status. He also proposed that the vote be given immediately to some African Americans. For example, the very intelligent, and especially those who have fought bravely in our ranks. On the question of Reconstruction, however, Lincoln and the extremists of his own party stood even further apart in early 1865 than they had a year earlier. Some radicals had begun to call for a period of military occupation of the South, the confiscation of planter estates and their distribution to freedmen, and the transfer of political power from planters to former slaves. In April 1865, Lincoln began to change his position on some issues, and thus began to narrow the gap between himself and the radicals. He recalled the permission granted to the Virginia rebel legislature to convene, and he did not disapprove in principle, or at least in principle, of Stanton's scheme for military occupation of the southern states. After the April 14th cabinet meeting, Attorney General James Speed assessed that Lincoln was moving toward a radical position. "He never seemed to get anywhere near our ideas," Speed believed. What Lincoln's Reconstruction policy would have been had he lived to complete his second term can only be guessed at. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, 26-year-old John Wilkes Booth, a Southern abolitionist and the fiery son of one of the most prominent theatrical families of the 19th century, shot Lincoln as he sat in Ford's Theater in Washington. Lincoln died the next morning.